I am Jada, 34 years old, and somehow still recovering from the trauma inflicted by my own family. As a successful founder of a venture capital firm that quietly moves billions of dollars, I successfully escaped their overwhelming toxicity 9 years ago. They had absolutely no idea who I had become until last week. My older sister Googled my name for the very first time. She called our mother screaming. Then she called our father. Then our brother. Within the next 24 hours, I had 63 voicemails on my private secure line. Every single one of them said the exact same two words: save us. Before continuing this story, let me know where you started reading in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you have ever faced family members who severely underestimated your worth and treated you like a disposable burden. Growing up in the affluent, high society circles of Atlanta meant appearing perfectly privileged to all the outsiders looking in. But inside our sprawling imported brick home, emotional coldness permeated every single corner. Our massive house, with its neatly manicured lawns and perfectly curated social gatherings, was a suffocating fortress of expectations I could never possibly meet. My childhood bedroom became my only sanctuary until they violently stripped it away from me. They threw me out into the cold streets with exactly $500 and told the entire neighborhood I was having a severe psychological breakdown. It was a Tuesday morning when the ghosts of my past finally breached the walls of my sanctuary. The panoramic windows of my penthouse offered an unobstructed sweeping view of the sprawling Atlanta skyline. From 40 stories up in the air, the city below looked peaceful, organized, and entirely under my control. I stood in the exact center of my immaculate kitchen, feeling the cold, imported Italian marble beneath my bare feet. I cradled a warm ceramic mug of dark black espresso in my hands, letting the bitter steam rise against my face. The silence of the penthouse was usually absolute, engineered by expensive state-of-the-art soundproofing that kept the chaos of the world outside. However, inside my head, the chaotic noise was absolutely deafening. I could still hear the frantic, terrifying pattern of those 63 voicemails playing on a continuous loop in my mind. The voices of my mother and sister were stripped of their usual aristocratic polish, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. They were drowning in the devastating consequences of their own fraudulent actions, and they fully expected me to act as their personal life raft. A soft melodic chime shattered the heavy silence of the kitchen. The polished steel doors of my private elevator, which required a heavily encrypted biometric security scan to operate, began to slide open with a gentle mechanical hum. I did not reach for the emergency panic button installed under the marble counter. My chief of security had sent a priority message to my tablet 3 minutes prior, asking for immediate authorization to physically remove two highly agitated, unauthorized individuals from the main lobby. I had specifically instructed him to let them come up to my floor. I wanted them to step out of that elevator. I needed them to witness the towering, untouchable empire I had meticulously built from the miserable ashes they had left me in 9 years ago. My mother, Patricia, marched out of the elevator first. Even while facing absolute financial ruin, she desperately clung to the superficial illusion of wealth. She wore a tailored, cream-colored designer suit, her expensive pearls resting perfectly against her collarbone, and her dark hair styled into an immovable, flawless bob. But the practiced high society facade was severely cracking under the intense pressure of her reality. The expensive designer heels that usually glided with aristocratic grace now clicked frantically and aggressively, echoing like rapid gunfire against my polished marble floors. Her eyes, wide and heavily lined with deep exhaustion, darted wildly around the sprawling penthouse. She took in the soaring vaulted ceilings, the expensive contemporary art hanging on the walls, and the sheer undeniable magnitude of my personal wealth. My older sister Vanessa trailed right behind her, looking like a slightly faded, highly anxious clone of our mother. She clutched a thick premium leather folder tightly against her chest, like it was a physical weapon. They bypassed all basic human decency, skipped any semblance of a polite familial greeting, and completely ignored the 9 years of devastating, painful silence that stood between us. Patricia marched directly to the kitchen island, completely invading my personal space. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not offer a single word of apology for the horrific way she had treated me. She simply raised her arm and violently slammed the heavy leather folder onto the pristine marble counter, nearly knocking over my espresso mug. "Sign this guaranteed document right now," Patricia demanded, her voice carrying that exact same authoritative, piercing tone she used to command our childhood household. It was the condescending tone that had once made me shrink into myself and desperately pray for invisibility. "Vanessa and Preston are facing commercial foreclosure by the end of this week. The bank is going to take their estate, and it will completely ruin the Washington family legacy." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her statement hung suspended in the chilled, perfectly conditioned air of the penthouse. I did not even look at the legal document resting on the marble. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso and looked directly into the eyes of the two women who had intentionally erased my existence from their lives. "You barged into my home to demand that I save your estate?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly level. Vanessa slammed her hands down. "You owe us your signature today," she screamed. Patricia aggressively held out an expensive gold pen. I did not take it. I just smiled. I slowly lowered my gaze from the expensive gold fountain pen trembling in my mother's hand. I did not reach out to take it. Instead, I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored blazer. My fingers brushed against a crisp piece of paper I had kept securely locked in a temperature-controlled safe for exactly 3,285 days. I pulled it out, smoothed the perfectly sharp edges, and placed it flat on the cold marble surface of the kitchen island. I pressed my index finger firmly against the center of the paper and slid it slowly across the smooth stone toward Patricia. "Take a very close look," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that immediately sucked the remaining oxygen out of the sprawling penthouse. "Does this look familiar to you, Mom?" Patricia stared down at the marble counter. Her confident, demanding expression faltered, fracturing into a mask of sudden, undeniable guilt. Resting perfectly flat between us was a single crisp $500 bill. "Take it," I insisted, holding her terrified gaze and refusing to let her look away. "It is exactly what you threw at my face 9 years ago. Do you remember that night? Because I remember every single second of it with absolute clarity. I remember coming home from working a 14-hour double shift at a diner. I smelled like cheap cooking grease and bleach. My feet were bleeding inside my shoes. I was exhausted to my very bones. But I was proud because I had just received my final community college transcript. I walked into the house eager to finally transfer to a real university, only to find my entire childhood bedroom completely emptied of everything I owned. My bed, my desk, my clothes all packed away into garbage bags." Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, crossing her arms over her chest, but I ignored her. I kept my eyes locked on Patricia. "I remember walking into your home office and logging into our shared banking portal. I discovered that my entire college savings account had been completely drained. $50,000, the money I had painstakingly saved since I was 15 years old, wiped out in a single afternoon. And for what? Because Vanessa absolutely needed a 12-foot swan ice sculpture, imported white orchids from Holland, and a custom designer gown for her lavish wedding. You stole my entire future to buy centerpieces." "Easy, sassy. We needed to make a good impression," Patricia stammered, her voice shaking as she defensively clutched her designer handbag. "Preston comes from a very prominent family. We had to show them that the Washingtons belonged in their elite circle. It was a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of this family." "You did not ask for a sacrifice," I countered smoothly, the anger burning cold and steady in my chest. "You committed theft, and when I stood in the hallway and cried demanding my money back so I could pay my tuition, you did not comfort me. You did not even show an ounce of remorse. You picked up the phone and dialed 911. You stood on our front porch crying fake dramatic tears, and told two armed responding officers that your youngest daughter was having a severe, violent psychological breakdown. You told them I was unstable, dangerous, and a physical threat to your perfect household. You stood there and watched those officers violently slam me against the side of their patrol car. You watched them put me in handcuffs. Then you changed the locks, threw this exact $500 bill at my feet on the driveway, and told me to never show my face in your pristine neighborhood again. Vanessa scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes, as if my deeply traumatic past was merely a minor inconvenience to her morning schedule. "Oh, please, Jada," Vanessa sneered, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "We are not doing this ridiculous, exaggerated victim narrative right now. You were acting completely crazy that night. You were screaming and throwing things. Preston needed that wedding to impress his wealthy investors, and securing his success ultimately benefited the whole family. You obviously survived. You are living in a penthouse. Stop holding a childish grudge and just sign the document so we can go home and save the estate." Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of my penthouse foyer swung open. My older sister's white husband, Preston, stepped into the room, casually bypassing my security detail, as if he owned the entire building. He had always carried himself with an unearned, incredibly arrogant sense of superiority. For the past decade, he had aggressively used our successful Black family as a convenient diversity shield, leveraging our minority status to secure lucrative government grants for his shady, borderline illegal financial dealings. He looked around my pristine penthouse, his mouth immediately twisting into a condescending smirk that made my blood boil. "Let us drop the angry Black woman act, Jada," Preston said casually, adjusting his custom silk tie as he confidently walked toward the kitchen island. He stood next to his wife, radiating the suffocating energy of a man suffering from a massive white savior complex. "We are not here to beg for your charity, and we certainly do not have time for a dramatic therapy session. My investment firm just needs a temporary liquidity bridge to get through a slightly rough financial quarter." "You got lucky with some little tech application and good for you. It is cute. But this is the big leagues. Sign the loan guarantee to cover my operating margins, and I will do you a massive favor. I will give you a 2% equity stake in my new commercial real estate project on the East Coast. It will finally be your golden ticket to sitting at the wealthy grown-up table. Consider it a family discount." A temporary liquidity bridge, 2% equity, a ticket to the grown-up table. I looked at this arrogant, deeply corrupt man who had aggressively drained my family dry, who had manipulated my mother and sister into turning against me, and I felt a genuine, terrifying smile slowly spread across my face. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed brightly off the high vaulted ceilings. The absolute nerve of him coming into my secure home to offer me worthless crumbs from his failing, fraudulent empire was the funniest thing I had heard in 9 years. I picked up my silver tablet from the marble counter and tapped the bright screen exactly twice, bringing up an internal, highly confidential financial report. "I do not need 2% of your little project, Preston," I said, turning the glowing screen so he could clearly see the bold, flashing red lettering stamping across his entire corporate portfolio. He squinted at the screen and the color instantly drained from his pale face. His hands started shaking violently at his sides. "My venture capital firm acquired the commercial bank holding your primary mortgage this morning," I told him softly, watching his arrogant, perfect world completely collapse in real time. "You are already bankrupt, and I own everything." Preston staggered backward, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping harshly against the pristine marble floor. The sophisticated, untouchable investment broker facade he had meticulously maintained for a decade shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my kitchen island. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound materialized. He simply stared at the glowing tablet screen, his eyes wide with absolute terror as he watched the red numbers of his massive debt solidify under my corporate holding company. Vanessa lunged forward, grabbing his rigid arm, her voice shrill and demanding as she desperately tried to understand why her husband looked like he had just seen a ghost. Before Preston could formulate a pathetic excuse or another empty threat, The heavy oak doors of my penthouse foyer swung open for a third time. My private security guard stepped aside, his hand resting firmly on his radio, as my father stormed into the room. Richard Washington did not walk. He marched with the heavy, aggressive footfalls of a man who demanded absolute submission from everything in his path. He was a massive, imposing figure, wearing a sharply tailored suit that struggled to contain his broad shoulders. For the first 24 years of my life, his sheer physical presence in a room was enough to make my heart race with crippling anxiety. He ruled our family with an iron fist and a volatile temper. But today, standing in the center of the financial empire I had built with my own blood and sweat, he just looked like a desperate aging man clinging to the crumbling edges of a failing logistics business. He completely bypassed the customary family greetings. He did not look at me with the pride a father should have for a daughter who became a billionaire. He only looked at me as an exploitable asset. He held a ridiculously thick, leather-bound legal dossier clutched tightly in his massive hands. He marched straight to the kitchen island, shoving Preston out of the way, and violently slammed the dossier down right next to the crisp $500 bill. "You listen to me right now," my father growled, pointing a thick, aggressive finger directly at my face. His deep baritone voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings, designed to intimidate and overpower. "You are going to sign a document assuming all of Preston's corporate debt today, and then you are going to immediately inject $10 million of liquid capital into my logistics company to save my supply chains." I crossed my arms over my chest, refusing to shrink under his physical intimidation or his booming voice. "And exactly why would I do that, Dad?" I asked quietly, my voice remaining perfectly calm against his rage. Richard slammed his heavy fist onto the marble counter, causing my espresso mug to rattle loudly. "Because the foundational algorithm you used to build your entire financial empire was written 10 years ago on a desktop computer that belonged to my logistics company," he shouted, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of purple. "I still have the old purchase receipts and the digital timestamps on the hard drives. Under corporate law, any intellectual property developed using company equipment legally belongs to the parent company. That means your software, your patents, and your entire venture capital firm legally belong to Washington Logistics." He tapped the thick legal dossier with a heavy finger. "If you do not bail us out right this second, Jada, I will file a massive injunction in federal court tomorrow morning. I have the best corporate lawyers in Atlanta on standby. I will freeze every single asset you have. I will lock your trading accounts. I will sue you for absolute corporate theft, and I will take your entire company away from you. You will be back on the street with absolutely nothing, exactly where you belong." The heavy silence in the penthouse was suffocating. My mother, my sister, my brother-in-law, and my father all stared at me, their chests heaving with desperate anticipation. They truly thought they had successfully cornered me. They genuinely believed their combined threats of total legal ruin and public social humiliation would force me into immediate submission. They expected me to break down, to cry, to beg for their mercy, and to sign away my life's work to save their fraudulent luxury lifestyles. I looked at the thick legal dossier. I did not even bother to open the first page. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. Instead, I smiled. It was a cold, calculated expression that immediately made my father's aggressive posture falter just a fraction of an inch. "File the injunction, Dad," I said smoothly, uncrossing my arms and gesturing gracefully toward the massive panoramic window overlooking the sprawling city below. "Take those ancient receipts to a federal judge and try to claim my life's work. I highly encourage you to try." Richard frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in utter confusion. My complete lack of fear deeply unsettled him. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his booming voice suddenly losing a significant portion of its confident edge. "I am saying you can file all the lawsuits you want," I whispered, leaning slightly across the cold marble counter to ensure he heard every single syllable. "But you might want to call your lead corporate accountant before you make that trip downtown to the courthouse." "Why?" Richard barked, his hands curling into tight fists. Because the Internal Revenue Service violently kicked down the glass doors of your logistics headquarters exactly 15 minutes ago, I stated, watching the absolute horror slowly register in his eyes. They are aggressively seizing your servers right now. The color drained from my father's face so fast he looked physically ill. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his heavy chest rising and falling rapidly as he struggled to process the catastrophic information I had just delivered. He fumbled frantically in his tailored suit pocket, pulling out his smartphone with trembling fingers. He did not even bother to step away from the kitchen island before dialing his lead accountant. The room was so quiet that everyone could clearly hear the phone ringing on the external speaker. When the call finally connected, the background noise on the other end was pure, unadulterated chaos. People were shouting in panic, heavy metal file cabinets were slamming violently, and loud sirens wailed in the immediate distance. "Marcus, what is going on over there?" My father yelled into the phone, his voice cracking with sudden, overwhelming panic. "Sir, you need to get down here right now," his accountant yelled back over the deafening commotion. "Federal agents have locked down the entire building. They are boxing up the hard drives and seizing all the physical ledgers. They have a massive federal warrant citing a decade of tax evasion and fraudulent shell company transfers. They are freezing the payroll accounts and the executive funds. We are completely locked out, sir. It is over." My father dropped his phone onto the marble counter. It landed with a loud, sharp clatter, the expensive screen cracking straight down the middle. He stood completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open as the accountant continued to shout through the cracked speaker. Patricia grabbed his arm, her eyes darting wildly between him and me, begging him to tell her it was a mistake. I leaned back against the counter, picked up my espresso, and took a final sip. The empire of lies was officially falling, and I had a front row seat. I watched my father stare blankly at his shattered phone on my kitchen island. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of the terrifying tyrant who had relentlessly dictated my entire childhood. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply nodded to my private security detail, who promptly and silently escorted the four of them out of my penthouse and directly into the service elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut with a definitive clang, sealing away the panicked whimpers of my mother and the terrified heavy silence of my father. I knew the quiet would not last. Cornered animals do not surrender gracefully when their survival is threatened. They bare their teeth, they thrash wildly against the trap, and they fight incredibly dirty. 2 days later, my prediction proved entirely correct. The desperate, highly coordinated smear campaign launched with staggering aggression. It started before the sun even breached the Atlanta horizon. My secure smartphone, which usually only buzzed with global market updates and secure executive briefings, began lighting up with an endless, frantic stream of media notifications. I sat at my glass desk in my corner office, sipping my hot morning tea, and watched the digital chaos unfold across my monitors. My family had officially gone on the offensive. Patricia had fully mobilized her extensive, carefully curated network within Atlanta's Black elite. She had spent the last 48 hours visiting every high society church group, exclusive country club luncheon, and influential charity board she had access to. She completely weaponized her social standing, painting a tragic, tearful, and entirely fabricated picture of our family dynamic. According to the urgent media briefs forwarded by my intelligence software, my mother had even secured a highly sympathetic exclusive interview with a prominent local lifestyle magazine. She boldly told reporters that her youngest daughter was a mentally unstable, wildly greedy woman who had returned from obscurity solely to destroy her hard-working family's historic legacy out of pure, unprovoked spite. She masterfully twisted the narrative of the sudden IRS raid and my commercial bank acquisitions. Patricia publicly claimed that I had maliciously orchestrated the federal investigations, using my billions to bribe government officials, all because I was currently suffering from a severe, untreated psychological delusion. She played the role of the heartbroken, deeply concerned matriarch to absolute perfection. She cried fake, glistening tears on camera and begged the public to pray for my fractured mind. She was aggressively trying to control the narrative, hoping to completely destroy my professional credibility in the corporate sector, before the federal indictments against my father and Preston became official public knowledge. She wanted to frame their upcoming arrests as the result of a crazy daughter's vendetta, rather than their own massive financial crimes. Trevon, my older brother, who had conveniently avoided the penthouse confrontation to hide in his luxury condo, eagerly decided to join the public circus. He possessed all of my father's overwhelming greed, but absolutely none of his physical courage. My computer screen flashed with a direct link to a highly popular, widely syndicated local business podcast. I clicked the audio file, leaning back in my ergonomic leather chair, as Trevon's voice filled my quiet, temperature-controlled office. He was playing the role of the concerned, deeply betrayed, and incredibly loyal sibling. I listened closely as Trevon claimed with absolute practiced sincerity that I had stolen the initial seed capital for my venture capital firm directly from our father's logistics company. He boldly told thousands of dedicated listeners that the family was simply trying to organize a loving medical intervention to get me the psychiatric help I desperately needed. He adamantly insisted that I had responded to their unconditional love by weaponizing my questionable, ill-gotten wealth to illegally freeze their hard-earned assets. It was a masterclass in psychological projection and public manipulation. They wanted the entire city to view me as a bitter, crazy, and vindictive woman, rather than a brilliant financial strategist who had legally and methodically outsmarted them all. They desperately wanted to make me a toxic pariah so my primary investors would panic and force me to step down from my own company. The heavy glass doors of my office swung open with sudden violence. My chief public relations director rushed into the room, her usual calm, collected professional demeanor completely shattered. She was clutching a thick stack of printed social media posts, glossy magazine excerpts, and highlighted transcriptions of Traven's podcast interview. "Jada, this situation is escalating much faster than our predictive models anticipated," she warned, dropping the papers heavily onto my pristine glass desk. "Your mother is actively rallying the entire charity board against you right now as we speak. They are attempting to pressure our secondary investors to pull their funding out of your upcoming tech projects. We need to issue a formal, highly aggressive denial immediately. We need to draft a comprehensive press release explaining the corporate debt acquisition, detailing your father's decade of tax evasion, and fully exposing Preston's offshore bankruptcies before the financial market opens tomorrow morning." I looked down at the frantic, sensationalized headlines printed on the papers scattered across my desk. The sheer audacity of their lies was staggering, but it was also entirely predictable. I smiled, a genuine expression of predatory anticipation spreading across my face. "No," I said calmly, sliding the stack of papers back across the desk toward her. "We are not issuing any statements. We are not going to play defense against their desperate lies." She stared at me in absolute shock, her hands resting on the cold glass. "Are you completely sure about this?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "Your entire family will be at the Black Excellence Charity Gala tonight, and they will control the entire narrative in that room if you remain silent." "I know exactly where they will be," I replied, standing up and confidently smoothing the front of my tailored blazer. "RSVP yes to the gala for me. We are going to let them dig their own grave." The grand ballroom of the historic downtown hotel was a masterclass in suffocating opulence. I stepped out of my armored vehicle into the warm evening air, flanked by two towering members of my private security detail. The Black Excellence Charity Gala was the absolute pinnacle of the Atlanta social season, a highly exclusive gathering where the wealthiest investors, prominent politicians, and elite socialites congregated to aggressively display their philanthropy. I walked through the heavy brass double doors, letting the overwhelming visual of massive crystal chandeliers and rich velvet drapery wash over me. The air inside the venue was thick with the heavy scent of expensive perfume-aged bourbon and imported floral arrangements. The lively, echoing chatter of hundreds of wealthy guests immediately began to falter the very second I stepped onto the landing of the grand staircase. As I walked slowly and deliberately down the carpeted steps toward the main floor, the elegant string quartet playing in the far corner seemed to fade entirely into the background. A suffocating, heavy silence rolled through the massive room like a physical wave. Hundreds of eyes turned simultaneously to stare directly at me. I could feel the judgmental weight of their collective gazes pressing against my skin, entirely fueled by the vicious, fabricated lies my mother had spent the last 48 hours aggressively spreading. I kept my posture completely rigid and my facial expression entirely unreadable. I signaled to a passing waiter, gracefully lifting a crystal glass of sparkling water from his silver tray. I continued my slow, calculated path toward the exact center of the ballroom. I did not avert my eyes from the staring crowd. I did not shrink under their collective scrutiny. I knew exactly what they had been told. They firmly believed I was a broken, dangerous, and incredibly greedy woman who had betrayed her loving family out of pure spite. I could clearly hear the hushed, frantic whispers rippling through the wealthy crowd as people leaned in close to one another, pointing discreetly in my direction behind their expensive champagne flutes. Some of these very people were the exact venture capitalists I planned to pitch for my upcoming corporate expansion next month. My mother had specifically chosen this highly public battleground because she believed the intense social pressure would force me into total submission. Near the brilliantly illuminated main stage, my mother Patricia was holding court. She stood at the center of a large, tight circle of influential banking executives and powerful city council members. She was wearing a custom emerald green evening gown that practically screamed old generational money. Preston stood right beside her, nursing a glass of expensive scotch, playing the role of the exhausted but steadfast son-in-law with sickening perfection. When Patricia caught sight of me cutting smoothly through the crowd, her eyes widened in a brief, involuntary flash of absolute panic. She clearly had not expected me to actually show up and face the firing squad she had meticulously assembled. But my mother had spent her entire adult life perfecting the art of high society social performance. Within a fraction of a second, she masked her genuine terror with a look of overwhelming, highly theatrical maternal concern. She saw an immediate opportunity to solidify her false narrative in front of the city's most powerful people, and she took it without a single moment of hesitation. Patricia aggressively pushed her way through the tight circle of wealthy donors rushing directly toward me with her arms outstretched. She intentionally positioned herself to physically block my clear path to the auctioneer's podium, making absolutely sure we were completely surrounded by the most prominent investors in the room. "Jada, sweetie, you actually came," Patricia announced loudly. She projected her voice with practiced theatrical precision, ensuring her desperate words carried across the silent, captivated ballroom. She reached out, attempting to forcefully grab my hands to complete the physical illusion of a loving, emotional reunion. I stepped back smoothly, leaving her perfectly manicured hands grasping at the cold, empty air between us. I refused to let her touch me. "This is my youngest daughter," Patricia declared to the watching crowd, pressing one hand dramatically against her chest. Her voice trembled with fake, calculated emotion, designed specifically to garner maximum sympathy from the wealthy onlookers. "She has been gone for 9 years, and she is struggling so deeply right now. But we are a family of faith, and we always keep our arms wide open for forgiveness, no matter just how terribly she behaves toward us." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, letting the uncomfortable, heavy silence stretch painfully between us. The surrounding banking executives exchanged uneasy glances, clearly captivated by the unfolding toxic family drama. "Forgiveness for what, Mom?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level and completely stripped of any defensive emotion. Patricia sighed heavily, shaking her head sadly as if dealing with a confused, unruly child. "For the confusion, Jada," she said softly, taking another aggressive step forward to invade my personal space. "For the very terrible misunderstanding about your father's company and the intellectual property. We know you are not in your right mind today. We just want to get you the psychiatric help you need, sweetie. You do not have to fight us anymore. Just come home. Sign the software rights back over to your father so we can protect the family business, and we will get you the medical care you so desperately require." The public gaslighting was absolutely nothing short of incredible. She was attempting to publicly shame me into total submission, weaponizing the very real, very damaging stigma of mental illness in front of the exact people I needed to launch my initial public offering. I looked past her shoulder and saw Preston smirking into his scotch glass. He clearly thought his diversity shield was holding strong, convinced that Patricia's public performance would force me to surrender my financial leverage to avoid absolute social ruin. He honestly thought they had successfully trapped me in an inescapable corner of public opinion. I handed my crystal water glass to my lead security guard without ever breaking eye contact with my mother. I sidestepped Patricia, completely brushing past her expensive emerald gown without uttering another word to her. I walked directly up the short wooden steps to the main stage, approaching the ornate wooden podium where the charity auctioneer was standing frozen in shock. I firmly grabbed the main microphone from the stand and turned around to face the sprawling, utterly silent ballroom. The feedback whined sharply for a brief second before settling into a low, steady hum. I stared directly at my arrogant, smirking brother-in-law. "I do not need psychiatric help, Mom," I said, my voice echoing with crystal-clear authority through the massive speakers lining the velvet walls. But Preston's offshore accounts definitely do. The collective gasp that erupted from the crowded ballroom was absolutely deafening. I stood firmly on the elevated stage, holding the heavy microphone with a steady grip, and looked out over the sea of horrified, wealthy faces. Patricia recoiled violently, dropping her hand from her chest as the blood completely drained from her cheeks. Preston froze entirely. The arrogant, condescending smirk that had been permanently plastered across his face just a fraction of a second earlier instantly vanished. It was replaced by a rigid mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked exactly like a man who had just confidently stepped onto a hidden landmine and heard the final fatal click beneath his expensive Italian leather shoes. I did not give him a single moment to recover or interrupt my momentum. For the past 4 years, my beloved brother-in-law has been playing a very lucrative, highly illegal game. I announced, my voice cutting sharply through the rising, chaotic murmurs of the wealthy gala guests. Preston has been actively leveraging the Washington family name to secure millions of dollars in exclusive federal grants and private investments. He deliberately presented his investment firm as a minority-owned business enterprise, aggressively using my parents and my sister as a highly convenient diversity shield. He sat in your executive boardrooms, he shook your hands, and he eagerly took your money, under the completely false guise of empowering Black entrepreneurs here in Atlanta. I paused deliberately, letting the heavy weight of my words settle over the furious investors standing in the audience. But Preston never invested a single dime of your capital into our community. He never built the commercial real estate projects he passionately pitched to you. Instead, he systematically funneled every single grant and investor deposit through a complex hidden web of fraudulent shell companies. And where exactly did that money go? It went directly into his private, untraceable offshore bank accounts located in the Cayman Islands. The entire ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Prominent banking executives shouted angry questions toward the stage. A city councilman standing near the front row looked like he was about to physically faint. Patricia shrieked hysterically for someone to cut the microphone feed, but my security team firmly blocked anyone from accessing the venue soundboard. I was completely in control of the room, and I was not finished speaking. I know some of you might find this difficult to immediately believe. I continued smoothly, stepping away from the wooden podium and walking much closer to the edge of the stage. After all, Patricia and Trayvon have spent the last 48 hours telling everyone in this room that I am a delusional, vindictive woman suffering from a severe mental breakdown. But unlike my deceitful family, I do not expect you to just blindly trust my words. I brought the actual receipts. I snapped my fingers loudly. At my signal, 6 members of my private security detail stepped through the brass double doors, carrying heavy leather binders filled with irrefutable evidence. They fanned out across the ballroom and dropped thick stacks of financial documents onto every single dining table. The investors scrambled aggressively to pick up the printed papers. What you are looking at right now are certified, authenticated copies of international wire transfers, I explained, pointing to the papers rapidly spreading across the venue. You will see the exact dates, the specific bank routing numbers, and the final Cayman Island destination accounts legally registered under Preston's personal name. You will see the fake vendor invoices he generated to bypass your compliance departments. Every single dollar you generously donated to his so-called minority empowerment initiatives actually paid for his private yachts and luxury European vacations. He stole from this community, and he laughed at you behind closed doors. A prominent venture capitalist sitting near the front row angrily slammed his fist onto his decorated table, his face turning purple with unfiltered fury as he read the routing numbers. Vanessa could not handle the sudden violent destruction of her perfect manufactured reality. She aggressively pushed her way through the angry crowd and ran directly to the front of the stage. Her expensive designer dress was wrinkled, and dark tears of panicked denial were streaming rapidly down her face. She was shaking with absolute desperation. "You are a terrible liar, Jada," Vanessa screamed, her voice cracking hysterically over the loud crowd noise. "You completely fabricated all of these documents. You printed fake bank statements because you are just a jealous, bitter woman trying to ruin my marriage. You are completely miserable and alone. Preston is a good man. He is a brilliant investor and he truly loves this family. You are just trying to destroy us because you are crazy." I looked down at my older sister, feeling absolutely zero pity for her willful, pathetic ignorance. "Vanessa, you personally signed the joint tax returns," I said softly, knowing the microphone would pick up every single syllable. "You willfully ignored the missing funds because you really liked the designer shoes and the luxury cars he bought you with stolen money. You happily traded your personal integrity for a wealthy lifestyle he purchased with stolen charity funds. You are not a helpless victim here tonight. You are a willing accomplice." Vanessa shrieked desperately, trying to climb onto the stage to physically attack me, but two security guards effortlessly caught her arms. She thrashed violently against them, completely losing her aristocratic dignity. Preston finally snapped entirely. The polite, sophisticated facade of corporate allyship he had meticulously crafted over the last decade shattered into a million jagged pieces. Recognizing that his immense wealth, his legal freedom, and his pristine public reputation were completely gone, he lost his mind. He shoved violently past a large group of angry investors, his fists tightly clenched at his sides. His pale face was contorted with a feral, incredibly ugly rage. He lunged aggressively toward the edge of the stage, his eyes locking onto mine with pure, unadulterated hatred. He pointed his trembling finger directly at my face, entirely forgetting where he was, who was watching him, and what cameras were recording. "You stupid ghetto bitch!" Preston roared at the top of his lungs, the racially charged insult tearing viciously through the elegant room and instantly shocking the entire crowd into absolute silence. The echo of his vile, racially charged slur hung suspended in the chilled, heavily perfumed air of the grand ballroom. The absolute suffocating silence that immediately followed was heavy and thoroughly defining. In a single violently reckless moment, Preston had entirely ripped away his own carefully manufactured mask of progressive corporate allyship. The wealthy investors standing around him, the very people who had championed his minority empowerment funds and invited him to their exclusive dinner tables, physically recoiled in disgust. A prominent city councilwoman standing just 2 feet away from him literally took a massive step backward, raising her manicured hand to her mouth in sheer horror. The powerful venture capitalist who had yelled moments earlier looked at Preston with a mixture of absolute disgust and predatory calculation. Preston's elite social standing within the affluent Atlanta society, a status he had built meticulously over a decade of firm handshakes and false promises, evaporated into absolute nothingness before my very eyes. He looked around the room wildly, his chest heaving, suddenly realizing that he had just publicly confirmed every single ugly allegation I had laid out on the tables. The true, undeniable tragedy of the evening was not Preston's inevitable downfall. It was my older sister's spectacular, willful delusion. Vanessa did not freeze in horror at her husband's blatant racism. She did not back away from the man who had just hurled a disgusting, degrading slur at her own flesh and blood in front of hundreds of people. Instead, she doubled down on her toxic choice. She broke free from the momentary shock gripping the crowd and hurled herself toward the wooden steps of the stage. My lead security guard, a towering man named Marcus, stepped forward to gently but firmly block her path. Vanessa did not even hesitate for a fraction of a second. She raised her right hand and slapped him directly across the face with all her might. The sharp, violent sound of her palm striking his cheek cracked like a whip through the silent room, causing several guests to gasp out loud. Marcus did not flinch. He did not retaliate. He simply stood his ground like a solid brick wall, his expression completely blank. Vanessa clawed frantically at his broad shoulders, her face twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. When she finally realized she could not physically reach me on the stage, she directed her venom entirely upward. "You are just jealous of me," Vanessa screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking hysterically as she pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face. "You have always been jealous of me, Jada. You come in here with your fake bank documents and your fake moral superiority because you absolutely cannot stand the fact that I have a high-value man, and you have absolutely no one Preston provides for me. He elevates this entire family. He gave us a beautiful life you could never achieve on your own because you are too bitter and too aggressive to keep a man interested in you. You are completely alone in your cold, empty penthouse, and you are trying to drag my successful, loving husband down into the mud just to make yourself feel better about your miserable, pathetic existence." I stared down at the woman I had once idolized when we were innocent children. She was aggressively defending a man who had stolen millions in her name and had just degraded her entire race in front of the city's most powerful leaders. She actively preferred the comfortable, familiar lie of her luxury lifestyle over the incredibly painful truth of her own exploitation. I did not feel angry at her anymore. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. Patricia, seeing her precious golden child publicly unraveling and her entire high society empire burning to ashes, decided to launch one final, desperately pathetic offensive. She rushed forward, grabbing Vanessa tightly by the waist to pull her back from the towering security guard. She turned to the surrounding crowd of investors, her eyes wide and pleading. She plastered on a frantic, weeping smile that looked absolutely terrifying under the bright chandelier lights. "Please, everyone, I am begging you to ignore this entire spectacle," Patricia cried out, sweeping her trembling arms toward the stunned guests. "My daughter Jada is very sick. She is suffering from severe clinical delusions right now. These papers on your tables are meaningless forgeries printed by a deeply disturbed mind. Preston is a wonderful, upstanding businessman who has done nothing but support our community and love my daughter. We are just dealing with a private medical crisis that unfortunately spilled out into the public eye. Please, I ask for your grace and your understanding. Do not let the ravings of an unwell woman destroy the beautiful charity work we are all trying to accomplish here tonight." She was actually still trying to gaslight a room full of seasoned financial experts who were literally holding irrefutable bank routing numbers in their hands. The sheer level of denial was a masterclass in psychological preservation. A few guests murmured nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the rapidly escalating family meltdown, but absolutely no one moved to defend Patricia or Preston. The documentary evidence was simply too overwhelming, and Preston's aggressive, racist outburst had been entirely too revealing. They were completely isolated, standing alone in a sea of wealthy peers who had already mentally calculated the severe legal fallout and firmly decided to distance themselves from the radioactive Washington family. Preston finally found his voice again, though it was shaking with barely suppressed panic and humiliation. "I am calling my lawyers right now," he announced loudly, pulling his smartphone from his tailored jacket pocket. "I am going to sue you for criminal defamation, Jada. I am going to take that little tech company of yours and completely liquidate it to pay for the severe emotional damages you have caused my wife tonight. You have made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life." I leaned casually against the heavy wooden podium, watching him frantically dial his legal team. "You can certainly try Preston," I replied, my voice projecting smoothly through the microphone. But I highly doubt your expensive corporate lawyers handle criminal defense cases on a Friday night. Vanessa sneered at me, aggressively wiping dark tears and smeared mascara from her cheeks. You are bluffing. You have no real power here, Jada. You are just a bitter college dropout trying to play a corporate game you do not understand. I understand the game perfectly well, Vanessa, I said softly, looking past her toward the back of the room. In fact, I am the one who called the referee. At that exact moment, a heavy, resounding crash echoed from the back of the massive ballroom. The remaining hushed conversations died instantly. Every single head in the room, including Patricia, Vanessa, and Preston, whipped around toward the grand entrance. The heavy brass doors did not simply swing open. They were shoved apart with a violent, resounding crash that echoed over the chaotic murmurs of the wealthy guests. The lively string quartet, which had been attempting to awkwardly play through the unfolding disaster, stopped abruptly. The sudden silence in the massive room was absolute, save for the rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots marching across the polished marble foyer. It was not the venue's private security team coming to restore order to the disrupted charity gala. It was the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they were not here to mingle. A dozen federal agents flooded into the glittering room, their dark windbreakers a stark contrast to the sea of expensive tuxedos and designer gowns. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a grim expression, held up his gold badge. The wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites immediately parted like the Red Sea, desperately scrambling backward to avoid any physical proximity to the incoming federal raid. Patricia, who had just spent the last 5 minutes dramatically begging the crowd to ignore my so-called psychiatric delusions, froze entirely. The fake pleading smile she had plastered on her face melted away, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She clutched the edge of the nearest cocktail table, her knuckles turning white as she realized the true magnitude of the situation. She could not charm her way out of a federal indictment. The agents marched directly past the wooden podium where I was standing. They did not even glance in my direction. They moved with absolute precision, forming a tight, inescapable circle around the center of the room. 2 agents flanked Preston, grabbing him firmly by both arms. "Preston Spencer," the lead agent announced, his voice booming across the silent ballroom with undeniable authority. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, federal tax evasion, and grand embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Preston's arrogant facade completely evaporated. The sophisticated investment broker who had stood in their executive boardrooms and taken their millions was suddenly struggling and thrashing like a terrified child. "This is a massive mistake," he yelled, his voice cracking hysterically as the cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists, with a sharp, echoing click. "I am a prominent businessman. You cannot arrest me like this. Where is my lawyer? Call my father right now." Before Preston could finish his frantic, pathetic demands, another pair of federal agents moved toward my father, Richard, the once overbearing patriarch of the Washington family, a man who had proudly dictated every aspect of our lives with an iron fist and a booming voice, suddenly looked incredibly small and fragile. He did not fight back as the agents firmly cuffed his hands behind his back. He just stared blankly at the floor, the crushing reality of his decades-long financial crimes finally catching up to him. He was completely stripped of his power in front of the entire city. "Richard Washington," the agent stated calmly, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and international tax evasion." The elegant charity gala officially descended into absolute chaos. Prominent guests were frantically dialing their own legal teams, whispering aggressively into their smartphones to completely distance their portfolios from Spencer Investments. The wealthy venture capitalist who had yelled at Preston earlier was actively pointing out the federal agents to his furious board members, confirming the massive theft. The perfectly curated high society image that my mother had dedicated her entire life to maintaining was currently being dismantled on live television. Several attendees had boldly pulled out their phones to record the spectacular downfall of the Washington family. Patricia could not handle the sheer humiliation. Unable to control the narrative, unable to gaslight the FBI, and watching her husband being led away in handcuffs, she chose her signature defense mechanism. She let out a dramatic, piercing gasp and gracefully collapsed onto the carpeted floor in a perfectly executed theatrical faint. A few catering staff members rushed over to check on her, but the elite guest simply stepped over her prone body, eager to escape the radioactive blast radius. Meanwhile, my older brother Trayvon realized the devastating trap had fully closed around them. The loyal son who had eagerly gone on a popular podcast to publicly smear my name and accuse me of theft, suddenly decided that family loyalty had a strict expiration date. He tried to quietly slip away from the main stage, keeping his head down as he moved quickly toward the kitchen service exit. He thought he could abandon his family to save himself. He almost made it to the swinging wooden doors before two federal agents stepped out of the shadows, blocking his path entirely. "Trayvon Washington," an agent said, aggressively grabbing his shoulder. "You are also under arrest for knowingly signing off on the fraudulent federal grants submitted by Spencer Investments. Put your hands behind your back." Trayvon immediately burst into tears, dropping to his knees right in front of the kitchen doors. "I did not know what he was doing," Trayvon sobbed hysterically, pointing a shaking finger directly at Preston across the room. "He told me the shell companies were perfectly legal. I just signed the paperwork. He promised me a bonus. Please do not take me to jail. I am innocent." As the agents hauled Trayvon roughly to his feet, Preston stopped struggling against his own captors. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto Vanessa, who was standing completely frozen near the stage. My sister was trembling violently. Her designer dress rumpled, her perfect makeup ruined by dark streaks of panicked tears. She had spent the entire evening fiercely defending him, slapping a security guard and screaming that I was just a bitter, jealous woman trying to ruin her perfect marriage. Preston glared at the woman who had happily traded her integrity for his stolen money. He did not offer her a single comforting word. He did not promise that his powerful father would fix everything. Instead, he bared his teeth in a vicious, ugly snarl. "This is all your fault," Preston screamed at his wife, his voice echoing brutally across the silent, captivated ballroom. "You and your pathetic ghetto family dragged me down. You are nothing but greedy parasites. I should never have married into this garbage." Vanessa flinched violently, stepping backward, as if he had physically struck her across the face. She stared at him, her eyes wide with absolute devastation. The brilliant illusion of her perfect white knight, the high-value man she had sacrificed her own flesh and blood to keep, shattered completely into a million jagged, irreparable pieces right before her eyes. The morning sun offered absolutely no warmth as it rose over the cold, unforgiving concrete steps of the federal police precinct in downtown Atlanta. Less than 12 hours had passed since the Federal Bureau of Investigation violently raided the charity gala, spectacularly dismantling my family's fraudulent empire in front of the city's most powerful elite. I stepped out of the back seat of my armored sport utility vehicle, flanked immediately by my lead corporate attorney and two towering members of my private security detail. I was not there to visit my disgraced relatives or offer them a shoulder to cry on. I was there for a scheduled meeting to formally submit the final encrypted digital logs to the district attorney, proving exactly how Preston and my father had systematically manipulated the financial market. The crisp morning air smelled faintly of vehicle exhaust and stale coffee. I barely made it to the second concrete step before two frantic, disheveled figures detached themselves from the dark, imposing shadows of the precinct waiting area. It was Patricia and Vanessa. The flawless, untouchable high society polish they wore so proudly the night before had completely melted away, leaving behind a stark, pathetic reality. Patricia was still wearing her custom emerald green evening gown, but it was heavily wrinkled, torn near the delicate hemline, and stained with spilled coffee. Her heavy theatrical makeup was completely smeared beneath her exhausted, bloodshot eyes. Vanessa looked even worse. She was shivering uncontrollably, in a thin gray cardigan hastily thrown over her ruined designer dress, clutching her expensive leather purse tightly against her chest, like a completely useless life preserver. They had clearly spent the entire long, agonizing night sitting on the uncomfortable, rigid plastic chairs of the precinct waiting room. The harsh reality of their complete financial ruin had fully set in. Every single bank account tied to the Washington family and Preston's investment firm had been officially frozen by federal mandate. They completely lacked access to a single dime. They could not hire a competent criminal defense attorney, and they certainly could not pay the massive cash bail required to free the men in their family. Patricia lunged forward, her previous arrogant demeanor completely replaced by a pathetic, overwhelming panic. My lead security guard immediately stepped between us, holding up a firm hand to block her path, but I silently instructed him to let her speak. "Jada, thank God you are finally here," Patricia cried out, her voice cracking harshly as she reached her trembling hands toward me. "You have to help us right now. The strict federal magistrate just set the bail. It is $2 million in cash for your father and Trayvon. You simply must wire the money to the bondsman right now. They are transferring them to the county jail within the hour, and they will not survive in there. You have to save them today." I stopped on the concrete steps looking down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. Why exactly would I pay $2 million to release men who actively plotted to steal my company and destroy my life yesterday? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. Vanessa pushed her way forward, fresh tears streaming rapidly down her pale, ruined face. "Because Preston left us with absolutely nothing," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the towering precinct walls. "His wealthy father refuses to answer any of our calls. They completely cut us off this morning. You saw what Preston did last night. You heard what he called us in front of everyone. He is a racist monster, and he aggressively manipulated all of us. We are your family, Jada, and we have literally nowhere else to go. You cannot leave us." I stared at my older sister, feeling absolutely zero sympathy for her sudden realization. You were not an innocent victim when you were happily spending stolen charity money on luxury cars and expensive European vacations, Vanessa. You were a highly willing participant in his fraud. You only hate him today because the federal government permanently turned off the money printer and he insulted you publicly. You made your choice 9 years ago. Patricia let out a loud, theatrical sob, dropping to her knees on the cold, unforgiving concrete. She desperately grabbed the hem of my tailored coat, tears streaming freely down her ruined makeup. "Please, Jada, I am begging you on my hands and knees," Patricia wailed, putting on the performance of a lifetime. "I know we made terrible mistakes. I know I was entirely too harsh on you, but we are blood. You cannot just walk away from your own flesh and blood. You cannot let your father and your own brother rot in a federal cell. We are the only real family you have left in this world." I looked down at her desperately grasping hands, disgusted by her physical touch. I pulled my coat away from her grip. "Blood," I repeated softly, letting the heavy word hang in the crisp morning air. "You absolutely love to use that specific word when you are backed into a corner and need a bailout. You demand absolute loyalty based on blood, but you treat your own blood worse than your enemies." I reached into my sleek leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and extracted a stack of legal documents. "What is this?" Patricia asked, her voice dropping to a nervous whisper. "Are these the financial release forms for the bail?" "No, Mom," I said, forcing her to look at the top page. "This is a commercial bank loan application from exactly 9 years ago. The money was urgently needed to cover Preston's bad investments. You deliberately forged my signature on this application after throwing me out. You took a massive loan in my name, gave the stolen money to Preston, and intentionally defaulted, destroying my credit. I am pressing criminal charges today. Enjoy your prison." I left my mother kneeling on the cold concrete steps of the federal precinct, her desperate theatrical sobs fading entirely as the heavy glass doors closed securely behind me. My meeting with the district attorney took exactly 45 minutes. Handing over the certified forensic evidence of my mother's financial fraud felt like a massive physical weight finally lifting off my chest. For 9 years, I had quietly carried the heavy burden of her toxic secrets, silently enduring the severe financial and emotional damage she had actively inflicted upon me. I walked back out to my waiting armored sport utility vehicle, completely ignoring the empty spot on the pavement where Patricia and Vanessa had been standing earlier. My lead security guard opened the heavy, reinforced door, and I climbed into the pristine, quiet leather interior. I instructed my driver to head directly to my corporate headquarters. I watched the busy city blocks roll past the tinted windows, feeling a profound, undeniable clarity. I had finally severed the rotten roots of my past. Suddenly, my secure smartphone buzzed sharply in the cup holder, shattering the peaceful silence of the vehicle. I looked down at the glowing screen. The display indicated an incoming call from an unknown restricted local number. I swiped the green icon and brought the device to my ear. An automated robotic voice immediately announced a collect call originating from an inmate at the Fulton County Correctional Facility. I pressed the required key to accept the charges, fully anticipating the panicked voice on the other end of the line. "Jada, thank God you actually answered the phone," the voice whispered frantically through the receiver. It was my older brother, Trayvon. He sounded absolutely terrified, completely stripped of the arrogant, condescending confidence he had proudly displayed on that business podcast just 3 days ago. The chaotic, terrifying background noise of the county jail echoed loudly through the receiver. I could hear heavy metal doors slamming shut, angry voices shouting in the distance, and the distinct echoing sounds of a hostile environment. Trayvon was breathing heavily, clearly trying to hide in a quiet corner to speak without being overheard by the other agitated inmates. "Listen to me, Jada." Trayvon continued, his voice trembling with raw desperation. "You have to listen to me very carefully. I know Mom and Vanessa are losing their minds right now, but you and I are completely different. We are the smart ones in this family. We always have been." I leaned back against the leather headrest, keeping my voice entirely devoid of any sibling affection. "We are not the same, Trayvon," I stated firmly. "You willingly went on a public platform and told thousands of people that I was a mentally unstable thief. You actively tried to destroy my professional reputation to protect a white-collar criminal." Trayvon let out a frantic, pathetic laugh. "I had to do that, Jada. You know exactly how Dad operates. He forced me to say those things on the podcast. He violently threatened to cut me out of the family trust if I did not help him control the public narrative. We were just kids trying to survive Dad's aggressive expectations. He pitted us against each other our entire lives. But I am not like him, and I am certainly not like Preston. They are the real criminals here. I was just an innocent pawn in their massive financial game." He was actively deploying a highly manipulative psychological tactic, desperately trying to weaponize our shared childhood trauma to manufacture a false sense of solidarity. He wanted me to view him as a fellow victim of our father's abuse, rather than a grown man who had willingly and greedily participated in a massive federal fraud scheme. I did not interrupt his frantic monologue. I opened my silver laptop, connected it to the secure vehicle network, and waited for him to finally reveal his actual agenda. "I can help you completely destroy them," Trayvon whispered urgently, his voice dropping an octave. "I know the federal agents seized the main servers at the logistics company, but Preston and Dad kept a secondary, highly encrypted set of internal company files on a hidden drive. Those files contain explicit proof of every single illegal wire transfer, every fake minority business grant, and every offshore routing number. The FBI does not have those specific files yet, but I know exactly how to get them. I can hand you the golden ticket that guarantees they both spend the rest of their lives in a federal penitentiary. I will testify against them in open court. I will be your star witness." "That is quite a generous offer," I replied smoothly, staring at a flashing alert on my computer screen. "But I know your loyalty always comes with a very specific price tag. What exactly are your demands, Trayvon?" He exhaled a shaky breath of relief, genuinely believing I was taking his bait. I need you to post my cash bail immediately. I cannot survive in this county jail, Jada. You have to get me out of here today. I also need you to cover my criminal defense attorneys because my personal assets are completely frozen. And once this entire mess blows over, I need a fresh start. You have a massively successful financial technology firm. I want a high-level executive position in your C-suite. Make me a vice president of operations. Give me a comfortable salary and a generous stock options package. If you do all of that for me today, I will hand you the hidden files and serve Dad and Preston up on a silver platter. The unadulterated audacity of his request was absolutely staggering. He was facing decades in federal prison for eagerly signing off on fraudulent documents. Yet he genuinely believed he was in a position to successfully negotiate a lucrative corporate career. He thought he could easily extort his way into my empire by offering me information he assumed I desperately needed. I clicked on the flashing red alert on my laptop screen, opening a highly classified security report compiled by my elite cybersecurity team just a few hours prior. I read through the complex digital footprints, the blocked IP addresses, and the severe firewall breaches. You are offering me the hidden internal company files. I repeated slowly, making absolutely sure he understood my words. Yes, Trayvon confirmed eagerly. The exact files that will guarantee they never see the light of day again. Just pay my bail and give me the executive job and they are entirely yours. I pulled up the server logs, my eyes tracking the exact timeline of the digital assault. You mean the highly encrypted files you desperately tried to hack into and steal from my private corporate servers last night while you were out on an untraceable burner phone? I asked, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy calm. The exact internal financial files my intelligence team legally extracted from Preston's poorly secured systems 2 weeks ago, niece try Trayvon. I immediately disconnected the call, leaving Trayvon to face the harsh reality of his cold concrete cell entirely alone. The flashing red alerts on my laptop screen slowly transitioned to a steady green, confirming that my cybersecurity team had permanently locked out his burner phone. He had genuinely believed he could outsmart me completely, ignoring the fact that my 9 years away were spent in meticulous preparation. I closed the laptop, allowing myself a brief moment of deep satisfaction before preparing for the next inevitable attack. The deep satisfaction of leaving Trayvon to face his inevitable prison sentence was incredibly short-lived. In the high-stakes world of venture capital, victory is often temporary, and cornered billionaires do not simply surrender. Less than 12 hours after my father and Preston were arrested, my secure smartphone buzzed with an urgent priority notification from my lead legal counsel. The notification sent a sharp, freezing jolt straight through my veins. Preston was no longer sitting in federal custody. He had officially made bail. The massive $2 million cash bond had been posted in full by his father, William Spencer. William was a notoriously ruthless corporate raider, a man who had built his immense fortune by dismantling vulnerable companies and selling off their vital parts for scrap. I knew immediately that William would not simply let his son face federal prison without launching a massive destructive counteroffensive. The Spencer family weaponized their generational wealth and immediately went on the aggressive offensive. By Tuesday morning, William and Preston launched a colossal multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against me and my venture capital firm. They completely fabricated a narrative designed to make me look like a rogue cybercriminal. The sprawling lawsuit falsely claimed that I had orchestrated a massive illegal corporate espionage campaign against Spencer Investments. They argued that my team did not acquire their debt through legitimate financial due diligence, but rather by hacking into their private servers and manipulating their internal ledgers to artificially trigger the devastating margin calls. Their strategy was a highly calculated targeted strike aimed directly at the heart of my financial empire. William Spencer utilized his deep political connections to exploit an obscure, archaic legal regulatory loophole within the state's commercial code. He managed to convince a sympathetic district judge to grant an emergency temporary injunction against my firm. This specific injunction temporarily suspended the operational licenses of my 3 secondary financial technology platforms. Those 3 specific platforms were the essential processing hubs that handled the daily algorithmic trading for my entire firm. Without those active operational licenses, my company could not legally process any external transactions. The timing of this malicious injunction was absolutely catastrophic. We were exactly 14 days away from launching our highly anticipated initial public offering. If the temporary injunction was not lifted within the next 72 hours, the powerful regulatory commission would officially delay the public offering indefinitely. A heavily delayed public offering simply meant losing billions in projected market capitalization. William and Preston were systematically cutting off my corporate oxygen supply right before the most important financial milestone of my entire career. My smartphone vibrated softly on the polished glass surface of my desk. I quickly picked up the device, fully expecting another frantic update from my panicked legal team. Instead, a bright text message glared back at me from an untraceable number. The highly arrogant tone was absolutely unmistakable. The message boldly read, "You play checkers. I play chess. Sign over your company or lose it all." I stared at the glowing screen, reading Preston's text message again. I did not reply to him. I locked my screen, pocketed the device, and left my private office. The main corporate hallway was electric with panic. Assistants typed furiously, fielding endless calls from angry investors who had read the news about the temporary injunction. I pushed through the heavy double doors of the executive boardroom where my entire board of directors was already assembled. The shouting was deafening. 12 prominent financial minds were losing their composure. Seeing me enter, the yelling instantly directed itself at me. Marcus, my lead venture capital backer and the chairman of the board, slammed his hands onto the polished mahogany table. He looked absolutely terrified. The upcoming initial public offering was his golden goose, and he saw it slipping through his fingers. He aggressively demanded to know why I had provoked a ruthless corporate raider like William Spencer mere days before our company was supposed to go public. "We cannot afford a prolonged legal battle with the Spencer family right now," Marcus yelled, his face flushed with severe anxiety. "The Regulatory Commission is already threatening to indefinitely suspend our trading licenses. If we miss this specific public offering window, we lose $3 billion in projected market capitalization. The secondary markets will tear us to shreds. You need to fix this right now, Jada. You need to call Preston and offer him a massive settlement. Give him whatever financial concessions he wants so he drops the civil lawsuit." Several board members loudly agreed, aggressively demanding I surrender my leverage to save their investments. They were cowards, completely intimidated by the aggressive tactics of corporate bullies. Before I could instruct Marcus to sit down, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom were shoved open with incredible force. My security guards tried to block the entrance, but they were legally outmaneuvered by a swarm of expensive corporate attorneys waving signed building access mandates. William Spencer marched into my boardroom like a ruthless, conquering king. Preston walked right behind his father, an incredibly smug, victorious smile plastered across his face. My board of directors fell completely silent, thoroughly intimidated by William Spencer's sudden, aggressive physical presence. William ignored them entirely, focusing his predatory gaze directly on me. He gestured to his lead attorney, who stepped forward and threw a thick, professionally bound legal document onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. "This is a final settlement agreement," William announced, his deep voice carrying a tone of unbreakable authority. "We are offering you a very generous way out of this mess. If you sign this document today, we will immediately drop the civil lawsuit. We will formally petition the judge to lift the temporary injunction against your secondary trading platforms, allowing your public offering to proceed as scheduled." I looked down at the document, keeping my hands perfectly still at my sides. "And what exactly am I giving up in exchange for this remarkable generosity?" I asked quietly. Preston stepped forward, unable to hide his gleeful, toxic satisfaction. "You are stepping down immediately as Chief Executive Officer of this firm," Preston declared. "You will surrender your voting rights on the board. Furthermore, this document legally absorbs your primary financial technology algorithms into the Spencer investment conglomerate. You get to walk away with a small severance package, and your precious investors get to keep their public offering timeline. Checkmate, Jada. Marcus and the rest of my board members stared at the settlement document with desperate eyes. They did not care if I lost my company as long as their personal financial investments were protected. I reached out and picked up the thick settlement document. Preston's smile grew even wider, anticipating his ultimate victory. But I did not reach for a pen. I simply tossed the document over my shoulder, letting the pages scatter uselessly across the expensive carpet. I reached under the mahogany table and pressed a hidden security button. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung shut with a loud click, and the electronic deadbolts engaged simultaneously. "Nobody is signing anything," I stated firmly, locking my hands behind my back. "Let us look at who actually owns your conglomerate, Preston." The heavy silence in the locked boardroom was absolutely deafening. Every single eye in the room tracked my movements as I walked deliberately toward the sleek control panel embedded in the center of the polished mahogany conference table. William Spencer crossed his arms, his arrogant posture remaining firmly in place, but a flicker of genuine uncertainty flashed in his cold eyes. He let out a deep, dismissive scoff. "I do not have time for a colorful slide presentation, Jada," he growled, stepping toward the locked glass doors. "Unlock these doors immediately before I have my legal team file criminal kidnapping charges against you and your entire board of directors. You are playing a very dangerous game with the wrong family." I ignored his pathetic threat entirely. I tapped my silver tablet, and the ambient lighting in the executive boardroom immediately dimmed. The massive floor-to-ceiling high-definition presentation screens descended smoothly from the ceiling behind me. My board of directors, who had been loudly demanding my resignation just 5 minutes earlier, sat completely frozen in their leather chairs. I swiped my index finger across the tablet screen. A highly complex, densely interconnected web of corporate ownership illuminated the darkened room, glowing in sharp blue and crimson graphics. "You see, William, my public venture capital firm is just the visible surface of my massive operation," I explained, my voice projecting clearly across the long table. For the past 9 years, while my family was busy spreading vicious rumors about my mental health and attending lavish country club dinners, I was not just building a simple financial technology application. I was meticulously constructing a financial apex predator. Beneath this public entity lies a massive, completely untraceable labyrinth of anonymous shadow holding companies. I designed them specifically to hunt, isolate, and consume toxic corporate debt. And for the past 36 months, my primary target has been the Spencer investment conglomerate. The dismissive smirk on William Spencer's face began to falter rapidly. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he desperately tried to read the tiny text labeling the various corporate entities glowing brightly on the screen. "You built your entire reputation as a ruthless corporate raider, William." I continued, pacing slowly across the front of the room. "You proudly dismantled vulnerable businesses and sold off their vital assets for massive, unprecedented profits. But your aggressive acquisition strategy required an enormous amount of liquid capital. You became dangerously greedy over the years. You heavily over-leveraged your primary corporate assets to aggressively fund your hostile takeovers. You borrowed heavily against your own historic legacy, and you borrowed those massive sums from a very specific, highly secretive offshore equity firm based in Zurich." I tapped the tablet screen again. The offshore equity firm's logo dissolved on the massive monitors, instantly replaced by the bold, undeniable emblem of my own private holding company. "I acquired that offshore firm exactly 3 years ago," I stated, watching the horrific realization finally wash over his face. "I bought up your toxic debt for pennies on the dollar through a series of completely untraceable proxy organizations. Every single time you took out a massive, high-interest loan to crush a commercial competitor, you were actually borrowing money directly from me. I am your primary creditor. I own the mortgage on your massive corporate headquarters, I own the financial liens on your private aviation fleet, and I own the massive institutional loans propping up your entire global portfolio." The entire boardroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and frantic whispers. My board of directors were now staring at the presentation screens with absolute, unadulterated awe. Marcus, the chairman of the board, slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. He finally understood the breathtaking scale of my strategy. I had not jeopardized our upcoming initial public offering by provoking a random billionaire. I had systematically absorbed a massive, highly lucrative conglomerate, exponentially increasing our total market capitalization right before we went public. I had successfully turned a perceived legal liability into the greatest hostile asset acquisition in the history of our financial firm. Preston looked like he was going to be physically sick. He stumbled backward, bumping roughly against the locked glass doors. His breathing became shallow and highly erratic. He knew exactly what this catastrophic revelation meant for him. His father's immense wealth was the only protective shield keeping him out of a federal penitentiary. Without William's deep pockets and powerful legal connections, Preston was completely exposed to the wire fraud and embezzlement charges. The crushing weight of his impending incarceration settled heavily onto his shaking shoulders. He was entirely ruined. William Spencer slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, his face turning a dangerous, volatile shade of crimson. "What exactly do you want?" William roared, entirely abandoning his polished corporate decorum. "Name your price right now, Jada. I will buy the debt back from you at a 20% premium. I will wire the funds to your offshore accounts by the end of the business day. Just name your absolute price and let us walk out of here." I looked at the desperate, ruined man standing before me. "I do not want your money, William," I replied softly, shaking my head with profound satisfaction. "Your dirty money is completely worthless to me. I wanted your total, undeniable destruction." I picked up my silver tablet and looked directly into his terrified eyes. I pressed the flashing red confirmation button on the screen, instantly initiating the catastrophic margin calls across his entire global portfolio. I just called in the debts. "You have 24 hours to pay $150 million, or I liquidate your entire lineage." The heavy boardroom doors remained locked for another suffocating 10 seconds after my ultimatum dropped. William Spencer, a man who had built his entire career on crushing weaker opponents, finally understood what it felt like to be swallowed whole. He did not say another word. He simply turned around, grabbed the heavy brass door handle, and waited for my security guard to release the electronic deadbolt. The moment the lock clicked, William shoved the glass door open and marched down the hallway without looking back. He did not wait for his son. Preston scrambled frantically after his father, his face pale and his breathing ragged, leaving my terrified board of directors sitting in stunned, absolute silence. I had given the Spencer family exactly 24 hours to produce $150 million in liquid cash. We all knew it was mathematically impossible. Their entire liquid fortune was already tied up in the fraudulent shell companies that the federal government had actively frozen. They had absolutely no way out. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the financial markets had already reacted violently to the blood in the water. The news of the Spencer conglomerate facing massive catastrophic margin calls leaked directly to the financial press. But the ultimate cowardice of my brother-in-law became apparent just before my lunch break. Preston did not stay to fight the federal indictments or face his angry investors. He completely drained whatever hidden domestic cash reserves he had left, abandoned his luxury estate in the middle of the night, and attempted to run. He left his wife behind to face the devastating consequences entirely alone. I was sitting at my glass desk reviewing the final compliance paperwork for our initial public offering when the private intercom on my desk buzzed sharply. My lead receptionist sounded incredibly tense. She informed me that my older sister was standing in the main lobby, aggressively demanding an audience with me and refusing to leave until she was granted security access. I instructed my receptionist to send her up. I wanted to look my sister directly in the eyes now that her perfect manufactured reality had completely collapsed. When the heavy mahogany doors of my private office slowly opened, I barely recognized the woman standing in the doorway. Vanessa had always been the golden child, a woman who meticulously curated her public image with designer clothing, flawless makeup, and a permanent condescending smirk. The person standing before me looked absolutely destroyed. She was wearing an expensive silk blouse, but it was visibly wrinkled and heavily stained with spilled coffee. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled, messy nest falling around her pale face. Her eyes were swollen red and completely bloodshot from crying. She clutched a large, heavy leather handbag tightly against her chest, looking around my pristine office like a terrified, cornered animal. Jada Vanessa whispered, her voice cracking as she took a hesitant step forward. "Please, you have to help me." He took everything. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, crossing my arms over my chest. I did not offer her a seat. "Who took everything, Vanessa?" I asked coldly. She stumbled forward, stopping just short of my glass desk. Tears began spilling down her ruined cheeks. "Preston," she sobbed, her shoulders shaking violently. "I woke up this morning and he was completely gone. He packed a single bag in the middle of the night. He emptied our joint checking accounts and maxed out the emergency credit cards. The federal agents are literally standing in the driveway of my house right now with a massive foreclosure warrant. They are putting yellow tape across my front door. I have absolutely nowhere to go. I do not even have enough money to buy a decent meal today." She reached across the glass desk, attempting to grab my hands, but I smoothly pulled them back. She let out a pathetic, dramatic wail. "I am so sorry," Jada Vanessa cried, dropping her face into her hands. "I am so incredibly sorry for everything I said to you at the charity gala. I was not in my right mind. Preston brainwashed me. He manipulated me for years. He isolated me from reality and made me believe all those terrible things about you. He controlled my finances and my thoughts. You have to believe me. I was just a victim of his psychological abuse." She wiped her nose with the back of her trembling hand, completely abandoning all her high society dignity. "You are my little sister," she pleaded, her voice taking on a desperate, high-pitched whine. "We share the exact same blood. You cannot let me sleep on the streets. Please, just let me move into your penthouse. I will stay in the smallest guest room. I will not bother you at all. I will be the loyal, loving sister I always should have been. We can start over, Jada. We can be a real family again. I just need a safe place to stay until this massive nightmare blows over." I sat perfectly still, listening to her pathetic, fabricated monologue. She was deploying the exact same manipulative tactics my mother used. She wanted to erase a decade of deliberate, malicious cruelty by simply playing the role of a helpless, brainwashed victim. She honestly thought I would forget how she had eagerly participated in my destruction just because she was suddenly broke. I reached out and picked up my silver smartphone from the glass desk. I simply unlocked the screen, navigated to my secure voicemail inbox, and turned the media volume all the way up to maximum. I pressed play on a saved audio file. The crisp, incredibly clear recording echoed loudly through the silent office. Vanessa's own voice rang out sharp and full of vicious, unfiltered venom. "Jada, you useless bitch, wire the money to Preston's account now or we will ruin you." The recorded message ended with a harsh electronic beep. Vanessa stared at the phone, her jaw dropping open in absolute horror. The sound of her own voice dripping with malice completely shattered the victim narrative she had just tried to construct. She could not blame Preston or claim isolation after explicitly demanding my financial ruin. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. "You were not brainwashed," I said softly. "You were just outsmarted." Vanessa stared at the smartphone as if it were a highly venomous snake preparing to strike. The sheer magnitude of her own recorded cruelty hung heavily in the air, completely suffocating her pathetic attempts to play the innocent victim. She opened her mouth to formulate another weak excuse, but absolutely no words materialized. I reached over to my desk console and pressed a silver button. Two towering members of my private security detail stepped into the office within seconds. "Please escort my sister to the main lobby," I instructed them calmly, without looking away from my computer screen. "Ensure she does not attempt to access the executive elevator ever again." Vanessa did not fight them. She simply turned around and walked out, her shoulders slumped in total defeat. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, restoring the absolute peace of my sanctuary. I immediately returned my attention to the complex financial models required for tomorrow's initial public offering. Exactly 1 hour later, the sharp ringing of my secure private line shattered the productive silence. I glanced at the caller identification display. It was Patricia. I briefly considered sending the call directly to voicemail, letting her drown in her own manufactured misery, but the strict timeline of my corporate acquisitions told me exactly why she was calling. The federal asset freeze had perfectly aligned with the commercial foreclosure schedule I had been actively monitoring all morning. I swiped the green icon and brought the phone to my ear, offering absolutely no greeting. "Jada, you have to do something right now," Patricia shrieked through the speaker. She was completely devoid of her usual high society composure. The bank representatives are literally standing in our front driveway with local county sheriffs. They are officially foreclosing on the mansion. They are telling us we have to vacate the premises immediately because the property was seized in the massive federal asset freeze. You have to stop them. You have to call your wealthy corporate lawyers and buy the house back from the commercial bank today. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, listening to the frantic, chaotic background noise of my childhood home being aggressively repossessed. I could clearly hear Richard yelling angrily at a sheriff deputy, his patriarchal authority utterly useless against a federal warrant. Why exactly would I buy a heavily mortgaged, overpriced estate that is currently sinking in massive federal tax liens, Mom? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. Patricia let out a desperate theatrical sob. "Because this is the historic Washington family estate, Jada. This massive house is a vital property in the Atlanta Black community. We have proudly hosted governors, mayors, and prominent civil rights leaders in these very halls. You cannot possibly let a piece of important Black legacy fall into the cold hands of some nameless, faceless commercial bank. It is an absolute disgrace to our heritage. Your ancestors would be deeply ashamed of you for letting white corporate bankers strip us of our generational wealth. You are a billionaire. You have a strict moral and cultural obligation to preserve this house for the culture and for our family." Her unadulterated audacity was truly breathtaking. She was actually attempting to weaponize our racial heritage to guilt-trip me into saving her luxury lifestyle. She was using the exact same manipulative playbook Preston had used when he hid his massive financial fraud behind a diversity initiative. She did not care about Black excellence or historical legacy. She only cared about losing her imported crystal chandeliers, her sprawling manicured lawns, and her prominent status at the local elite country club. "You did not care about generational wealth when you completely drained my college fund, Mom," I reminded her, my voice turning to solid ice. "You did not care about protecting Black women when you called the police on your own daughter and tried to get me locked up in a psychiatric ward just to cover your illegal tracks. You eagerly sold out your integrity for a country club membership and a custom designer dress. Do not dare invoke our ancestors to pay your past due bills." "Jada, please!" she wailed, instantly abandoning the cultural guilt trip for raw, unfiltered panic. "Where are we supposed to go? Your father is facing a massive federal trial. Trayvon is locked out of his bank accounts. We have absolutely nothing left. You cannot just leave us out on the street like common criminals." "I am not leaving you anywhere," I replied smoothly, standing up from my desk and grabbing my tailored coat. "In fact, I am heading over there right now to handle the situation personally. Make sure you are standing in the front driveway when I arrive." I disconnected the call before she could utter another frantic word. I did not waste a single second. I signaled my private security team and took the express elevator down to the underground parking garage. My armored sport utility vehicle was already waiting, the powerful engine purring quietly. I instructed my driver to head directly to the northern suburbs. I also made a quick phone call to dispatch a very specific crew I had kept on standby since early this morning. The drive took exactly 45 minutes. When my vehicle pulled through the towering wrought iron gates of the Washington estate, the scene was one of absolute, undeniable ruin. The sprawling, beautifully manicured lawns were cluttered with federal vehicles and local police cruisers. Patricia and Richard were standing on the grand brick driveway looking entirely displaced. When Patricia saw my vehicle approach, a massive wave of pure relief washed over her tear-stained face. She truly believed I had arrived to write a massive check and rescue her social standing at the 11th hour. I stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp afternoon air hitting my face. Right behind my vehicle, a massive commercial moving truck pulled into the driveway, its loud air brakes hissing sharply. A coordinated crew of workers in matching uniforms stepped out, holding heavy dollies and massive packing boxes. Patricia frowned, looking completely confused at the massive truck. "Jada, what is going on here?" she asked nervously. "Did you wire the money to the bank? Did you stop the foreclosure?" I walked directly up to my mother, looking at the sprawling historic mansion that had once served as my childhood prison. "It did not fall to the bank, Mom," I said smoothly. "I bought it at auction this morning. And you have exactly 2 hours to get off my property." The absolute shock that paralyzed Patricia's face was a masterpiece of poetic justice. She stood entirely frozen on the grand circular brick driveway, her mouth opening and closing silently, as she desperately tried to process the catastrophic reality of my words. The historic Washington estate, the ultimate symbol of her meticulously fabricated high society status, was no longer hers to fiercely protect. It belonged entirely to the daughter she had violently discarded 9 years ago. The crisp afternoon air was immediately filled with the chaotic industrial sounds of aggressive disruption. The coordinated crew of muscular movers in matching blue uniforms bypassed my stunned mother and marched directly through the heavy mahogany front doors. They carried oversized, cheap cardboard moving boxes, thick rolls of packing tape, and heavy-duty dollies. They did not care about the untouchable Washington family legacy. They only cared about clearing the sprawling property before their shift officially ended. I stood firmly behind the protective line of my private security detail, watching the complete and utter dismantling of my childhood prison. Vanessa was weeping silently near a growing stack of cheap cardboard boxes, her designer silk blouse completely ruined by her tears. Trayvon, who had apparently managed to secure a temporary release from the county jail through a heavily leveraged bail bond, paced nervously near the towering wrought iron gates. He constantly checked his smartphone, desperately hoping his overwhelmed public defender would call with a miraculous legal loophole to save him from a lengthy federal prison sentence. But the most spectacular transformation belonged to my father. Richard Washington was out on federal bail, having managed to secure his temporary freedom by aggressively liquidating the very last hidden remnants of his offshore shell companies. He looked absolutely exhausted. His expensive custom-tailored suit was heavily wrinkled and hung loosely on his massive frame. However, despite facing absolute financial ruin and severe federal indictments, his inherent toxic arrogance remained firmly intact. He could not handle the humiliating sight of commercial movers unceremoniously carrying his expensive imported oil paintings out the front door and tossing them into the back of a rented truck. The sudden loss of his absolute patriarchal control over the family estate finally caused him to snap. The thick veins in his neck bulged dangerously against his white collar. He stormed forward aggressively, shoving past a mover who was carrying a delicate antique side table. "You need to stop this childish, vindictive tantrum right now, Jada," Richard roared, his booming, authoritative voice cracking with desperate, uncontrollable rage. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face, attempting to channel the terrifying tyrant that used to make me cower in fear. "You are completely destroying this family. This historic house is our generational legacy. You cannot just throw your own blood out onto the street like common garbage. I demand that you call off these movers immediately and sign the property deed back over to my name." He took another aggressive, threatening step toward me, his large hands curled tightly into massive fists. The aggressive physical intimidation tactic had worked flawlessly when I was a terrified 24-year-old girl with absolutely no financial resources or emotional support. It had worked effectively when he used his imposing physical presence to violently silence my mother and rigorously control my siblings. Physical dominance was the only language he truly understood. He wanted to physically force me into immediate submission to brutally reassert his patriarchal dominance over the rebellious daughter who had dared to successfully dismantle his fraudulent kingdom. Richard raised his heavy right hand, pulling it back high into the air as if he was going to violently strike me right there on the brick driveway. He fully intended to slap me across the face in front of the local sheriff deputies, the commercial moving crew, and his entire ruined family. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I did not even blink. My elite private security team reacted with terrifying clinical precision. Before Richard's raised hand could even begin its violent downward arc, my lead security guard, Marcus, stepped smoothly and rapidly in front of me. Marcus grabbed Richard's raised arm with an iron grip, twisting it forcefully and pinning it securely behind my father's back in a highly trained submission hold. The sudden aggressive physical restraint shocked Richard into absolute stunned silence. He gasped loudly in genuine pain as Marcus effortlessly held him in place, completely immobilizing the once powerful patriarch of the Washington family. I stared directly into my father's terrified wide eyes, keeping my voice perfectly level and devastatingly calm. "If you touch me," I whispered, making absolutely sure he heard every single syllable over the chaotic noise of the moving trucks, "I will personally call the district attorney. I will immediately revoke the generous plea deal my corporate lawyers offered them regarding your massive federal tax evasion. You will die in a federal prison, Dad. And I will make absolutely sure your cell does not have a window." Richard swallowed hard, the remaining color completely draining from his face. The aggressive, violent fight instantly left his aging body. He realized finally that he had absolutely no power left. He was a broken, ruined man standing on a driveway that no longer belonged to him, facing a daughter who held his entire life in the palm of her hand. I nodded slightly to Marcus, who released Richard's arm with a firm, calculated shove, sending my father stumbling backward toward Patricia. He crashed heavily into a stack of empty cardboard boxes, collapsing onto the hard brick pavement in a tangled, pathetic heap. For the very first time in his entire life, Richard Washington did not attempt to yell or fight back. He simply stayed on the ground, breathing heavily, completely defeated by his own spectacular hubris. Patricia covered her mouth with her trembling hands, absolutely horrified by the swift physical neutralization of her husband. Vanessa let out a sharp, terrified squeak, backing further away from the imposing security guards. Trayvon actually stopped pacing entirely, his eyes wide with newfound, unfiltered fear as he realized the true extent of my absolute authority. They finally understood the new reality. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been completely irreversibly obliterated. I was no longer the vulnerable, terrified scapegoat they could abuse and manipulate at their own convenience. I was the absolute master of their current reality, holding the keys to their freedom, their finances, and their future. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored coat, looking down at the four ruined architects of my childhood trauma. "The clock is aggressively ticking," I reminded them smoothly, gesturing toward the massive commercial moving truck. "You now have exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes left to pack whatever clothes you can carry before my security team physically escorts you off the premises. I highly suggest you stop wasting your time throwing childish tantrums and start filling those cheap cardboard boxes." The harsh reality of my ticking clock finally penetrated their thick layers of denial. Facing absolute, unavoidable ruin, the remaining members of the Washington family violently turned on each other. The thin, fragile illusion of their perfect upper-class solidarity instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces right there on the brick driveway. They were actively drowning, and they were aggressively trying to use each other as stepping stones to keep their heads above the rapidly rising water. Richard scrambled awkwardly to his feet, furiously brushing the dust off his wrinkled suit pants. Stripped of his historic mansion, his corporate empire, and his patriarchal dominance, he immediately sought a new target for his explosive, uncontrollable rage. He turned his lingering fury directly onto his wife. "This is entirely your fault!" Richard screamed at Patricia, his deep voice echoing sharply against the stone facade of the estate. Spittle flew from his trembling lips as he aggressively pointed a thick finger at her face. "You bled me completely dry for 30 years. You demanded the imported luxury cars, the lavish international vacations, and the ridiculous country club memberships, just so you could look down on your shallow friends. I had to take out those fraudulent federal loans to cover your massive, endless credit card debts. You forced me to cut corners, Patricia. You drove my logistics company straight into the ground because you absolutely refused to wear a designer dress twice in the same social season. You destroyed my entire legacy with your pathetic, overwhelming greed. Patricia recoiled as if she had been physically struck across the face. Her hands flew up to clutch her expensive pearl necklace, her eyes wide with terror and absolute unadulterated outrage. The meticulously crafted mask of the supportive, loving, high society wife completely dissolved into a terrifying snarl. She did not cower. She fought back with the viciousness of a cornered predator. "How dare you blame me for your catastrophic, pathetic failures as a man?" Patricia shrieked, her voice reaching a shrill, hysterical pitch that made the nearby commercial movers pause their heavy lifting to watch the spectacular meltdown. "You were the chief executive officer of the company you signed the illegal offshore transfer documents. You are a weak, pathetic coward who could not even manage his own corporate ledgers. And do not you dare pretend you did not enjoy the lavish, wealthy lifestyle I built for us. You loved showing off to the city council just as much as I did. You loved playing the role of the rich, untouchable king." Unable to physically or verbally overpower her enraged husband, Patricia wildly turned her furious gaze toward Vanessa. She desperately needed another scapegoat to absorb her overwhelming panic and deflect her own crushing guilt. She aggressively shoved her manicured finger toward her golden child, who was still weeping silently near the moving truck as workers hauled her expensive antique furniture out of the front doors. "And you," Patricia yelled at the top of her lungs, marching aggressively toward her eldest daughter. "You brought that arrogant, thieving white con artist into our sacred home. You married Preston because you desperately wanted to be a billionaire socialite, and you completely ignored all the massive glaring warning signs. He aggressively used our respected family name as a highly convenient diversity shield to commit federal wire fraud. He drained our remaining bank accounts, ruined our public reputation, and left us to face the Federal Bureau of Investigation entirely alone. This entire catastrophic nightmare is your fault, Vanessa." Vanessa gasped loudly, stepping away from the cardboard boxes as if they had suddenly caught fire. Her face was streaked with dark, ruined makeup, and her hands shook violently against her sides as she looked at the mother who had always fiercely protected her. The golden child was finally experiencing the brutal rejection I had survived for 9 years. "I did not know he was stealing federal charity money," Vanessa sobbed hysterically, desperately trying to defend her shattered reality. "You all loved Preston. You proudly introduced him to all your wealthy friends. You happily spent the stolen investment money he gave you to remodel the massive kitchen and buy your luxury cars. You are all completely hypocritical. You just hate him now because he finally got caught by the authorities and the money completely stopped. I am a victim here too. He lied to me just like he lied to all of you." Trevon could not handle the vicious circular firing squad for another single second. My older brother grabbed an empty cardboard box and hurled it violently across the brick driveway. It crashed heavily against the pavement, the sharp sound cutting through the overlapping screams of our parents. "You are all completely toxic and clinically insane," Trayvon screamed, his voice cracking with absolute raw desperation. He glared at his parents and his sister with unfiltered, overwhelming disgust. "You aggressively pushed Jada out of this house because she was the only person who saw right through your shallow, pathetic lies. You treated her like absolute trash for 9 years. You forced me to go on that stupid business podcast and blatantly lie about her mental health to protect yourselves. You caused this massive catastrophe, and now I am going to a federal prison because of your overwhelming, disgusting greed. We deserve exactly what is happening to us today." I stood silently behind my security detail, watching them aggressively tear each other apart. The afternoon wind picked up rustling the leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the property. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of finality wash over me. I watched the empire of lies crumble entirely from the inside out. They had built their entire identities on stolen wealth, fake status, and the brutal exploitation of anyone they deemed inferior. Without their dirty money, they had absolutely nothing left to hold them together. There was no loyalty. There was no genuine familial bond. They were just 4 angry strangers bound together by federal indictments, overwhelming debt, and mutual hatred. The foundation of their lives was entirely hollow. Richard collapsed onto a low stone retaining wall, putting his heavy head in his hands. He looked utterly defeated, a broken king staring at the smoking ashes of his fraudulent kingdom. Patricia stood completely frozen in the center of the driveway, her chest heaving rapidly as she finally realized that her precious social standing was permanently, irrevocably destroyed. She would never walk into the country club again. Vanessa sank to the hard pavement, weeping loudly into her hands, violently mourning the permanent loss of her luxury cars and her perfect, highly fictional marriage. Trevin simply stared blankly at the massive moving trucks, mentally preparing himself for a lengthy, brutal federal prison sentence. I stepped forward smoothly, signaling for my security guards to lower their defensive stances. The time for physical intimidation had completely passed. I walked slowly and deliberately across the brick driveway, the sharp click of my designer heels cutting through the heavy, devastated silence of their shared defeat. I stopped directly in front of the four people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel utterly worthless. They slowly looked up at me, their red eyes filled with a pathetic, desperate mixture of fear and lingering, foolish hope. They still secretly believed I might offer them a last-minute, generous lifeline. I unclasped my leather handbag and reached inside. I did not pull out a legal settlement, a forgiveness letter, or a charity donation form. I slowly extracted 5 crisp $100 bills. I held the cash in my right hand, looking down at the ruined architects of my childhood trauma. I casually dropped the $500 onto the top of a nearby cardboard moving box. The cash fluttered softly in the wind before settling onto the cheap cardboard. "Here is your severance," I said quietly, my voice entirely devoid of any emotion. "Do not spend it all in one place." I turned my back on the four of them standing completely frozen in the sprawling brick driveway. The cold afternoon wind ruffled the crisp edges of the $500 bills resting on the cheap cardboard box, but absolutely nobody made a single move to grab the cash. They were far too paralyzed by the sheer crushing magnitude of their complete and utter ruin. I walked smoothly and confidently toward my waiting armored vehicle, the sharp click of my designer heels cutting cleanly through the heavy, devastated silence of the estate. My lead security guard opened the heavy reinforced door for me, and I climbed into the pristine, quiet leather interior. As the vehicle pulled away, navigating through the towering wrought iron gates of the historic Washington estate, for the very last time I did not look back in the rearview mirror. I did not need to see their terrified, defeated faces ever again. I had completely severed all the rotten roots of my traumatic past, and the physical sensation was nothing short of absolute, unadulterated freedom. The toxic empire of lies was officially dead and buried. But the final act of this spectacular corporate tragedy had not yet concluded. By the time my dedicated driver navigated the congested Atlanta afternoon traffic and safely returned me to my downtown corporate headquarters, the major financial news networks were already breaking the next explosive headline. I stepped out of my private elevator, walked directly into my spacious corner office, and immediately looked at the glowing high-definition television monitors mounted on the wall. Bright red breaking news banners flashed aggressively across the bottom of every single screen. Preston Spencer, the arrogant, supposedly untouchable golden boy of the wealthy corporate elite, had just been dramatically apprehended by federal authorities. He was caught red-handed, attempting to permanently flee the United States jurisdiction. His spectacular, highly public downfall was not just a matter of sheer bad luck or slow federal agents. It was the direct, highly calculated result of a highly sophisticated, completely invisible digital trap I had meticulously set for him using my proprietary financial technology algorithms. Preston honestly believed he was playing a brilliant high-stakes game of chess against a complete novice. When the federal agents had initially raided the charity gala and legally frozen his primary domestic accounts, he had quietly relied on a secret, deeply hidden emergency cash reserve. He had maintained a covert, highly encrypted offshore account in an obscure international jurisdiction that traditionally ignored American federal warrants. He genuinely thought he could simply slip past the authorities, quietly access those hidden millions, and disappear forever to a luxury island without an extradition treaty. He severely underestimated the predatory nature of the financial technology firm I had built over the last 9 years. When I systematically bought up the majority debt of the Spencer investment conglomerate, my software automatically gained legal administrative access to all of their overarching financial routing protocols. My elite developers had deliberately deployed a specialized, highly aggressive fraud detection algorithm designed to actively monitor his hidden digital footprints 24 hours a day. The exact moment Preston desperately attempted to electronically transfer those hidden offshore funds to secure a private chartered flight out of the country, my algorithm instantly flagged the massive transaction. It did not just silently block the transfer of the stolen capital. The software legally and automatically reported the highly suspicious offshore movement directly to international banking authorities and the Federal Bureau of Investigation simultaneously. Preston was completely, utterly financially paralyzed in a matter of milliseconds. According to the frantic overlapping news reports echoing loudly through my office speakers, federal agents had aggressively swarmed Preston at the international terminal of the airport. He was standing near a private aviation gate, furiously screaming at a terrified airline ticketing agent because every single one of his exclusive platinum credit cards was being violently declined by the banking system. The federal authorities tackled him to the polished airport floor right in front of hundreds of shocked recording travelers. His custom Italian suit was completely ruined as they aggressively forced his hands behind his back. He had absolutely nothing left to his name except a single overpriced designer suitcase and the expensive clothes on his back. The billionaire white knight who had viciously insulted my race and exploited my family was currently sitting in a cold, sterile holding room at the airport waiting to be transported to a federal penitentiary. I sat down slowly at my sleek glass desk, letting the deep, profound satisfaction wash over me like a warm wave. I reached across the pristine surface and picked up a sleek rose gold smartphone that absolutely did not belong to me. It belonged to my older sister, Vanessa. During the chaotic, humiliating eviction at the Washington estate earlier that afternoon, my highly efficient corporate asset recovery team had systematically seized every single electronic device purchased using company funds. Because Vanessa had happily and ignorantly lived off the fraudulent corporate accounts aggressively managed by Preston and my father, her expensive phone was legally deemed a corporate asset by the federal courts. One of my agents had simply walked up to her in the driveway and legally demanded she hand it over. I had explicitly instructed my legal team to bring her confiscated device directly to my private office. I placed the rose gold device on the center of my desk, staring at the blank digital screen. I knew he would try to reach out. Less than 10 minutes later, the device vibrated violently, shattering the quiet, productive atmosphere of my office. The screen flashed brightly with an incoming call from an unknown restricted local number. The federal authorities typically allowed their high-profile suspects to make one heavily monitored phone call while waiting for official transport to the county jail. Preston, having been completely abandoned by his ruthless father and entirely stripped of his high-powered corporate legal team, was desperately trying to reach his wife. He urgently needed someone on the outside to secure emergency cash or beg a secondary lawyer to intervene immediately on his behalf. I reached out and slowly picked up the vibrating smartphone. I did not hesitate for a single second. I swiped the green icon to accept the call and brought the device up to my ear. I remained perfectly silent, waiting patiently for the desperate, ruined man to speak first. "Vanessa, thank God." Preston gasped heavily through the tiny receiver. His voice was completely frantic, entirely stripped of all its arrogant upper-class polish and condescending superiority. He was hyperventilating, struggling to form coherent sentences as the terrifying reality of his long prison sentence fully set in. "You have to help me right now. They arrested me at the terminal. My accounts are totally frozen. I do not have a single dime to my name. You have to call your mother and find some hidden cash today. You have to hire a lawyer and come get me from the airport immediately. They are going to lock me away." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, looking out at the beautiful, sprawling Atlanta skyline that I effectively owned. I took a slow, steady breath of the perfectly conditioned air. Try Uber Preston. I ended the call with a sharp press of my finger and dropped the rose gold device directly into the stainless steel trash bin beside my desk. I did not waste another second thinking about the pathetic man sitting in an airport interrogation room. The dawn of my absolute financial victory was breaking, and I had a historic company to successfully launch into the public stratosphere. The very next morning, the financial district of New York City was buzzing with an electric, entirely unprecedented energy. I stood proudly on the iconic balcony overlooking the massive, chaotic trading floor, surrounded by my highly loyal board of directors and the brilliant software engineers who had painstakingly helped me build my empire from the ground up. As the heavy brass bell rang out, echoing loudly across the crowded cheering room, the giant digital screens illuminated brightly with my company ticker symbol. Our initial public offering did not just succeed, it completely shattered every single projected financial estimate on Wall Street. The stock price skyrocketed within the first 10 minutes of active trading, instantly validating my highly aggressive acquisition of the Spencer investment conglomerate. The market loved the absolute ruthless efficiency of my hostile takeover. I had successfully transformed a devastating family betrayal into a multi-billion-dollar public triumph. The intense media frenzy that immediately followed the opening bell was absolutely staggering. My chief public relations director carefully guided me into a massive, brilliantly lit press room, packed tightly with seasoned financial journalists, national news anchors, and prominent industry bloggers. The camera flashes were blinding, a relentless storm of bright white light, capturing my historic moment of absolute victory. For the first 20 minutes, the questions were strictly focused on algorithmic trading protocols, massive market capitalization, and my highly aggressive corporate expansion strategies for the upcoming fiscal year. I answered every single complex financial inquiry with practiced, flawless precision, proving exactly why my company was valued in the billions. But I knew the purely professional atmosphere could not possibly last forever. The spectacular, highly publicized collapse of my prominent Atlanta family was simply too tantalizing for the national media to ignore. The vicious rumors Patricia had planted were still circulating, clashing violently with the breaking news of federal arrests. A senior correspondent from a major cable news network stepped up to the microphone stand in the center of the crowded aisle. The room immediately grew quiet, sensing a sharp, dramatic shift in the collective mood of the press corps. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at me with a piercing gaze. "Jada, your financial victory today is undeniably historic and incredibly impressive." The journalist began, her voice projecting clearly across the silent, captivated room. "But the national markets are also buzzing with the shocking news coming out of Georgia. Your brother-in-law, Preston Spencer, was arrested by federal agents at the airport yesterday. Your father and your brother are facing massive federal indictments for wire fraud and tax evasion. There are widespread, highly detailed rumors that you personally orchestrated their financial ruin and legally seized their historic family estate as an act of revenge. How exactly do you respond to the serious allegations that you ruthlessly destroyed your own flesh and blood to secure this public offering?" My public relations director stepped forward, immediately raising her hand to block the controversial inquiry. She opened her mouth to issue a standard, sterile corporate deflection about keeping personal family matters strictly private. I gently placed my hand on her shoulder, silently instructing her to stand down. I stepped much closer to the wooden podium, confidently adjusting the heavy microphone. I looked directly into the bank of television cameras, broadcasting live to millions of viewers across the entire country. I completely refused to hide behind polite corporate jargon. I absolutely refused to let my mother or the sensationalized media dictate my personal narrative for one more second. The world needed to hear the unfiltered, brutal truth about what really happens behind closed doors in the name of family loyalty. "I did not destroy my family," I stated calmly, my voice ringing out with absolute, unshakable clarity that silenced the entire room. "My family destroyed themselves through a highly potent combination of overwhelming greed, blatant financial fraud, and a profound, disturbing lack of basic human integrity. For 9 years, they aggressively perpetuated a vicious, highly damaging lie about my mental health to cover up the undeniable fact that they stole my entire college savings to fund a luxury wedding. They completely isolated me, threw me onto the street with absolutely nothing, and genuinely hoped I would simply disappear. When I finally returned as a highly successful woman, they did not offer sincere apologies or seek genuine reconciliation. They aggressively demanded my financial subservience. They expected me to silently absorb their massive legal debts and actively cover up their federal crimes just to aggressively protect a shallow, fabricated high society image. I paused deliberately, making intense eye contact with the diverse group of journalists who were furiously typing every single word on their glowing laptops. There is a highly toxic, deeply ingrained expectation in our society, particularly placed upon successful Black women. I continued leaning closer to the microphone. We are constantly expected to carry the heavy, suffocating burdens of our abusers. We are aggressively told to forgive the absolutely unforgivable for the sake of unquestioning familial loyalty. We are heavily pressured to use our hard-earned resources to blindly bail out toxic relatives who would happily drown us if it meant keeping their own heads above water. We are taught that setting firm, healthy boundaries makes us angry, bitter, or vindictive. I am standing here today to loudly, publicly reject that entire narrative. I completely refused to be the financial mule for a family that viewed my existence solely as an exploitable asset. Holding criminals fully accountable for their illegal actions is not corporate sabotage or family betrayal. It is simply justice. The press room remained completely spellbound. The raw, unfiltered honesty of my statement completely neutralized the scandalous rumors. I was not a vindictive, crazy daughter throwing a public tantrum. I was a formidable, highly principled leader who had successfully protected her enterprise from toxic parasites. I took a slow, steady breath, fully ready to deliver the final, most devastating blow to the Spencer legacy. I looked straight into the center camera lens, knowing my former relatives were likely watching from their miserable, ruined circumstances. I wanted them to hear exactly what was happening to their precious stolen wealth. Preston Spencer built his fraudulent empire by actively exploiting minority-owned businesses and aggressively stealing federal charity funds meant to uplift our community. I announced, my voice echoing with lethal, absolute precision. When my firm legally acquired his debt and totally liquidated his holding companies, we successfully recovered every single dollar of that stolen capital. I am not keeping a single cent of his dirty, blood-soaked money. I am incredibly proud to officially announce the creation of the Apex Foundation, a new, massive, philanthropic initiative funded entirely by the liquidated assets of Preston's fraudulent empire. Exactly 6 months later, the oppressive Georgia summer finally transitioned into a crisp, refreshing autumn. I drove my armored vehicle through the towering wrought iron gates of the former Washington estate for the very first time since the day of the eviction. The sprawling brick driveway where my family had violently turned on each other during their pathetic, highly public meltdown was completely transformed. Gone were the ostentatious European luxury cars and the chaotic piles of cheap cardboard moving boxes. In their place stood a neat, organized fleet of practical transport vans bearing the geometric logo of the Apex Foundation. The historic property, once a superficial monument to my mother's obsessive pursuit of high society validation, had been fundamentally and irreversibly repurposed. It was no longer a suffocating fortress of exclusion designed to impress wealthy, racist investors. It was a thriving, highly operational sanctuary. I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors and stepped directly into the grand foyer. The imported crystal chandeliers and the oversized, incredibly expensive oil paintings Patricia had obsessively hoarded were completely gone. I had liquidated every single piece at public auction to heavily fund our primary charitable endowment. The oppressive dark wood-paneled walls had been painted a bright, welcoming white, instantly lifting the heavy gloom that had plagued my childhood. The sprawling reception rooms that previously hosted fraudulent, hypocritical charity galas were now converted into modern educational classrooms, collaborative digital workspaces, and temporary emergency housing suites. The Apex Foundation was officially open and operating at maximum capacity. We were dedicated entirely to providing comprehensive financial literacy, aggressive legal protection, and immediate housing grants to young minority women who had been financially abused or abruptly kicked out of their homes. We were offering the exact critical lifeline I had so desperately needed when I was thrown onto the cold street with nothing but a $500 bill. The atmosphere inside the massive mansion was vibrant, buzzing with genuine, productive human energy. I walked slowly past the former formal dining room, pausing to watch a diverse group of 20 young women engaged in an intense, highly interactive workshop on building aggressive investment portfolios and securing independent business credit. They were not learning how to act as silent, obedient diversity shields for corporate predators. They were learning exactly how to build unbreakable financial armor. In the adjacent room, which used to be my father's oppressive, terrifying home office, a dedicated team of brilliant pro bono attorneys was actively helping survivors untangle fraudulent debts and reclaim stolen Social Security numbers. Every single inch of the sprawling property had been scrubbed completely clean of the Washington family's deceitful, highly toxic legacy. The house finally served a legitimate, honorable purpose. I stopped in the center of the grand foyer, standing on the precise spot where my father had raised his heavy hand to violently strike me 6 months earlier. He was currently serving the first miserable year of a lengthy sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his patriarchal dominance and his custom-tailored suits. Preston was locked in an adjacent federal facility, his vast offshore wealth permanently seized and rightfully redistributed to the very people he had ruthlessly exploited. Vanessa and Trayvon were navigating the harsh, unforgiving reality of bankruptcy courts and minimum wage employment, entirely cut off from the unearned luxury they had always felt so fiercely entitled to. I stood in the warm sunlight filtering through the large bay windows, feeling a profound, unshakable peace. Suddenly, my secure smartphone vibrated sharply in my blazer pocket, temporarily breaking my quiet reverie. I pulled the sleek device from my pocket and looked down at the glowing digital screen. It was an unknown, restricted local number. My elite security protocols normally filtered out all unapproved contacts, but public shelter landlines and prison phones occasionally bypassed the initial digital screening. I did not need to run a complex trace to know exactly who was on the other end of the line. It was Patricia. She had undoubtedly exhausted every other possible avenue, likely calling from a cheap burner phone or a public library terminal, desperately hoping to deploy one final pathetic guilt trip. She wanted to play the weeping, deeply apologetic mother. She wanted to beg for a small piece of the wealth she had viciously tried to steal from me. She genuinely expected me to answer the call out of some misplaced sense of familial obligation. I stared at the flashing restricted number for a long moment. 9 years ago, I would have answered that call in a heartbeat, desperate for any tiny shred of maternal affection. 6 months ago, I would have answered it just to listen to her grovel and bask in the cold, hard satisfaction of my ultimate revenge. But today, standing in the very heart of my own philanthropic empire, surrounded by the incredible lives I was helping to rebuild, I realized I felt absolutely nothing for her. The burning anger was completely gone. The heavy, suffocating resentment was gone. The desperate childhood need to prove my worth to her was completely, permanently erased from my soul. I did not owe her my valuable time, my hard-earned money, or my emotional energy. I smoothly pressed the red button instantly, rejecting the call and sending her directly into the digital void. I permanently blocked the unknown routing sequence and firmly tapped the icon to activate the Do Not Disturb mode. I slid the silent, darkened phone back into my pocket, letting go of the Washington family forever. I turned my back on the heavy front doors and walked deeper into the bustling, brightly lit Foundation headquarters. My lead project director spotted me from the end of the hallway and waved enthusiastically, holding up a thick clipboard filled with newly approved housing grants. Several young women looked up from their busy workstations, their faces breaking into wide, genuine smiles of pure appreciation and profound respect as I approached them. They did not care about my wealthy bloodline or my former high society status. They cared about the absolute safety and the brilliant future I had provided for them. I stepped into the joyful, vibrant room, completely surrounded by a chosen family that I had built on absolute truth, unwavering support, and mutual empowerment. I took a deep, clear breath of the fresh, clean air. I smiled a genuine, completely unburdened, and entirely peaceful smile as the warm, golden afternoon sun illuminated the entire room.